Okay, let me move on to some of the other questions about the ethics of food. So environmental impact is another question. And again, I think whereas the manure is more or less naturally dispersed over the areas, incidentally, the fences here are movable fences. So if you have the fields, you can distribute the manure and you can keep the grass fresh by moving the animals around with movable fences. If you can't do that, and particularly if you have the animals, thousands of animals confined in sheds, then this is the solution. This is an intensive farm, a pig farm, where the manure is flushed out into what's called a lagoon. If you ever think of, I thought of lagoons as those blue things around coral islands. This is a rather different kind of lagoon. It's basically a huge cesspit full of manure. And here's another shot of a pig farm. Here they're called aeration basins. Oh, no, that's where it goes after the lagoon. So the lagoon is this bit up there. Again, you've got thousands of pigs here, right? Nearly 9,000 hogs per site, 20 million gallons of manure there, and more sites up there, more lagoons, and so on. Now, if this works, then it's maybe environmentally okay as long as you don't live anywhere too close to it, obviously, because of the smell is very bad. But if you get extreme weather events, if you get exceptionally heavy rain, then the manure can flood out of the lagoons and get into the rivers and pollute rivers. And there's a lot of polluted rivers in the United States now as a result of intensive farming. You talk to some old-timer who comes out from rural areas of the United States, and they will tell you that often rivers that they used to fish in or even swim in are now so polluted that there are no fish, and you certainly wouldn't think of swimming in them. And so this kind of system is at least partly contributes to that river pollution. Now, I showed you this shot before from the point of view of intensive farming and animal welfare, but there's another aspect to it which connects with the discussion of climate change we had. Ruminant animals, of which the dominant ones in the United States are cattle, but it includes sheep, for example. Ruminant animals produce methane as part of their digestion. Methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. It's usually regarded as being 27 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. The quantities produced are not comparable, but what we are looking at here is producing a lot of methane. And this is a significant contribution to climate change, one that's often overlooked when we focus on the use of fossil fuels. But here's one way of looking at this comparison. So if you think, what ought I to do to reduce my carbon footprint? One thing that will occur to people is I could buy one of those hybrids. So I could swap over my, this is a Camry I think shown here, I could swap over my standard car, typical average American car, and buy a Prius, and I would reduce my carbon footprint. And that's true, you would. You would reduce it by about a ton of carbon per year, which is quite significant. But here's another thing you can do, the same authors calculate. If the typical American switches their beef-heavy diet to a vegan diet with the same number of calories, they save even more carbon, 1.5 tons of carbon. So that's another reason, although beef in a way is the least intensive, and from an animal welfare point of view, you could say it's better to eat beef than it is to eat intensive chicken or pork. From a climate point of view, it's actually worse to eat beef. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization made this point a few years ago in a report called Livestock's Long Shadow, saying that the livestock sector generates more greenhouse gas emissions than the whole of the transport sector, that is all of the cars, planes, trucks, ships, all of that put together. The livestock industry worldwide creates more greenhouse gas emissions. So that is a problem. And although you will often see farms or farmers' markets advertising grass-fed beef as a sustainable product. Unfortunately, that's not true when it comes to carbon emissions. It's true that it's better for the land, as I said. It's also true that you don't have to grow grain to produce the beef, which is very wasteful. I'll come to that in a moment. But grass-fed cattle actually produce more methane per pound of beef than grain-fed cattle. Why is that? It's because it takes them more digesting per pound of beef, because grass is low energy value and it contains cellulose, which their stomachs have to break up. That's why we can't eat grass. We can eat grain. We don't have the stomachs for it. They, of course, have this four-stomach system, which breaks up the cellulose. A lot of digesting goes on, and then they can grow. They put on weight. But the amount of digesting is more, so the amount of methane released as part of the digestion is more. So on a per-pound basis, they're actually worse for the climate than the grain-fed beef. Okay, but the other aspect of the grain is the fact that we are feeding so much grain to animals and getting back only a small portion of the food value that we put in. So here's one way of looking at this, a rather old chart, but I think still probably roughly right. If you try to get as much protein per acre, even if you just focus on protein, not on calories, it's always the plant foods that are going to give you more protein, with soybeans way up here over the top, and then other plant crops, and then you get to milk and eggs, which are the more efficient animal protein producing, and then meat in general, and then beef right down the bottom, the least efficient way of getting protein per acre that is commonly used. And if we're worried about global food prices and producing enough food to feed the growing population, then we ought to be very worried about the amount of grain and soybeans that's fed to animals. I compare this here with the amount of grain used to make ethanol, because there has been criticism of using grain to make ethanol on the grounds that it pushes world food prices up and that it's pushed more people into undernutrition, basically into being hungry, because world food prices have gone up and countries that need to import grain find it more expensive. But if you consider the amount of grain being wasted by being fed to animals, it's far greater, because it's more than 7 times as much grain is fed to animals as is used for ethanol. And roughly, yes, you could say maybe 4/5 of that is wasted. I'd say that's a guess, because when the amount that's fed to cattle, more than 4/5 would be wasted. The amount that's fed to chicken, probably less than 4/5 is being wasted. Chicken are more efficient at converting grain, but still they do waste you do get back only about 1/3 of the grain you put in. So it's a way of taking large quantities of food that we can eat, funneling it through animals and getting less food out at the end, and it therefore has an impact on global food prices. Okay, we're really more or less out of time. Supporting locally, eating locally is another thing that you can do for the environment, but actually in terms of saving greenhouse gases, if the reason is to reduce the distance that your food travels, again, going vegetarian or vegan is actually a bigger way of reducing your greenhouse gas footprint than buying locally. And another thing to consider is fair trade labelling, which does try to guarantee a livable wage to the producers of products like coffee and chocolate and tea that come from developing countries.